Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Georgetown Climate Center and the Georgetown University Law Center. My name is Kate Zyla. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center, and I'm really thrilled to have you all here today for this really fun conversation that we're going to have. I see some familiar faces in the audience, but I'm just going to take a couple minutes to say a little bit about the Georgetown Climate Center for those of you who don't know us well. In the United States, responding to the climate crisis depends on effective partnerships between state, federal, local, and tribal governments. And when different parts of government and different parts of the same government, different levels of government collaborate and communicate with each other as they develop policy, they can go farther and faster in achieving durable, equitable, and ambitious climate action for the health and welfare of the people in the country. That's why the Georgetown Climate Center was founded by state leaders in 2009 in order to work at the nexus of state, federal, and local climate action. We were created by states to help them work with government in DC and to look at policies and actions that they could work together to address climate change. So we really focus on breaking down barriers to communication, to collaboration, through analysis, through legal analysis, policy analysis, through convenings of officials, and through events like this one to spark conversation. And finally, GCC provides opportunities for students at the Law Center to work side by side with our staff on important climate change policy and legal research questions on problems that have been designed by our staff in collaboration with policymakers, NGOs, and other leaders in the field. So they have a chance to develop their skills in action and eventually come to work for agencies like NOAA. I'd like to take one moment to acknowledge our faculty director, Professor Peter Byrne, who's in the room tonight, and also to extend a special thank you to the Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, Pittman LLP folks for sponsoring the lovely reception that we just had, and to Joel Simon for making that happen. Thank you. The Georgetown University Law Center's Dean, Bill Traynor, could not be with us tonight, but extends his well wishes to the event. And in his absence, I have the honor of welcoming Dr. Rick Spinrad, Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to the Georgetown Law Campus for tonight's conversation. I was especially excited at the idea of hosting this particular event because of the really critical role that NOAA plays in providing the data that we need to understand how our climate is changing, and in turn to address the pollution that's causing it, and to make communities better prepared for and resilient to the impacts of climate change that they're already experiencing today. The work that NOAA does is so important for the work that we do and the work that policymakers do around the country to mitigate and respond to climate change. As the leader of NOAA's 12,000 person workforce, Dr. Spinrad provides strategic direction for NOAA's products and services to address the climate crisis, to foster environmental sustainability and economic development, and to bolster equity across all aspects of the agency's work and workforce. An internationally recognized leader with experience in academia and the private sector, Dr. Spinrad also served as NOAA's chief scientist and led NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research and National Ocean Service. Prior to initially joining NOAA, Dr. Spinrad held leadership positions at the U.S. Office of Naval Research and Oceanographer of the Navy. Dr. Spinrad received his BA in Earth and Planetary Sciences from the Johns Hopkins University, his MS and PhD in Oceanography from Oregon State University. We're delighted and honored to have him here with us tonight. Tonight's event is a collaboration between GCC, NOAA, and the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society, or FOLCS. And I'm also delighted to welcome the creative director and founder of FOLCS, Thane Rosenbaum, who will be conducting the conversation with Administrator Spinrad. Thane is a novelist, essayist, and distinguished university professor at Touro University, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. He's the author of several novels and books on law and the justice system, and serves as the national legal analyst for CBS News Radio. A few logistical notes before we get started. Today's conversation will be recorded and will be available on the FOLCS website later. We'll reserve the last 15 minutes of the hour for questions. There were cards on a table outside. We'll take those in writing. So if you want to write a question down and pass those to the end of your row, we'll collect those and use those later. If you didn't get a card, just raise your hand and the staff will bring a card by so you have a chance to share any questions you have. And again, let's get started. On behalf of Georgetown Law and the Georgetown Climate Center, welcome. And I'm going to hand things off to Thane. Welcome.
Thanks, Kate. Rick, welcome everyone. I am Thane Rosenbaum with FOLCS. This is the FOLCS Conversation Series. It is not our first event at Georgetown. There's a reason why we would be in DC. For obvious reasons, this is where Rick is. This is where weather is. You have weather here. And all the scientists and the regulators and the agencies. This is, if you want to do a climate discussion, this is the man to have it with. And in this city, at this university, of course, we're happy to be partnering not just with NOAA and of course the Georgetown Climate Center. And we have a very special relationship with Georgetown, which is not very well known, which is that we, the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society, were created around 20 years ago by the dean of this law school, Bill Traynor, when he was the dean at Fordham Law School. And at the idea, just to show you how forward-thinking he was, Fordham Law School was, excuse me, right next to Lincoln Center. And I was a member of the faculty, but I'm a novelist and I did cultural pieces in the New York Times. And he said something like, it's a very forward thing. You should, if you see him, you say, I love that story about you. He said to me, we're not using you right. He said, we're at Lincoln Center, light this place up. I love that, I'll never forget. He said, light this place up. So we, in all these years, we have hosted through the conversation series, former presidents, governors, United States senators, congresspersons, regulators from Paul Volcker, Federal Reserve Chair, Sheila Blair, the banking person. And I know this is, I ran through all the, Treasury Secretaries, Lauren Summers twice, 2 Supreme Court justices. We oftentimes have them in conversation about culture. So I was just telling Rick, we had Justice Breyer and I were in conversation about the old John Ford film, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. That's not the kind of thing you normally think that Breyer would talk about, but we talked about that. But we've also had Oscar winners and Tony winners and National Book Award winners and Pulitzer Prize winners over the years. Ben Kingsley, he's been knighted. But I'll tell you what we haven't ever had. We never had someone who makes rain. That's cool, an actual rainmaker in Rick. Although, where's Kate? Kate, you have that wrong. I hope you're right. I think you have it wrong. NOAA is spelled that way because I thought it was, with the one great extreme weather weirdness, the flood, right? And the arc and the 2x2, that's that guy. And so I hope that's the only time that joke has ever been delivered.
Never heard it before.
I just think that could have been done better, but I had the right idea. I said, I love the idea with the flood and the 2x2. And so welcome, Rick. There's so much to talk about. For instance, we had tornadoes last week. And my first thought about that was, and they seemed like really serious ones. And I said, I'm gonna talk to Rick about that. Because you know what I think? Speaking of culture, we're not in Kansas anymore. The Dorothy's Kansas tornado seems to me we're experiencing much more violent weather patterns. This program was created because our chairman of the board from Pillsbury, Joel Simon, who in fact Pillsbury did sponsor tonight's reception, he was the one that said at one of our program meetings, he said, there's something with the weather. It's just a bigger news. And in fact, I come from a generation where the weather girl on TV wasn't serious. She was called the weather girl. That's no longer true. Lori from NOAA said that's not true. These are all scientists now. So is it true that we are experiencing much more violent, more aberrant weather? Or is this tornado really sort of what Dorothy said?
So, well, first, let me just say thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. To Georgetown Law, to Pillsbury, to folks, this is a real honor for me to be here. And to be unscripted too is a special treat. So I really appreciate that. You may have to control me a little bit. So is the weather wackier is fundamentally your question. I'm always reminded of the phrase that Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, he popularized. He didn't coin it, but it's global weirding is the phrase he's used. And it basically comes down to this, that we know from fundamental physics, when you add carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you have a stronger greenhouse effect. So you're going to fundamentally put more energy into the system. When you put more energy into the system, a bunch of things happen. The oceans get warmer, atmosphere gets warmer. You see more dynamics. And so tornadoes, hurricanes, severe nor'easters that we see off the East Coast here, Yeah, we are seeing more of that kind of activity. And it's not just anecdotal. I mean, we keep track of this at NOAA. We keep track of, for example, the billion-dollar disasters, those weather and climate-related events that result in $1 billion or more of impact. And over the last 40 years or so, we've seen that go from typically 3 or 4 a year to last year we had 28. And we're on track to have a similar kind of number this year. So yeah, both from a statistical standpoint and anecdotal standpoint, it is getting more.
Numbers and severity, both there are more of them and they're more lethal.
Well, and they're different too. I did a piece recently that was basically called "This Is Not Your Parents' Hurricane Season." And it's if you think about, I don't know if we've got anybody from the Texas area, but a Hurricane Harvey that hit a few years ago, that hurricane dropped 60 inches of rain, 5 feet of rain. These storms, they're bigger, they seem to move slower, they're larger. We know that. We have the responsibility for flying through the hurricanes, which, oh, by the way, I've done once. That was enough.
Did you do that out of curiosity or did you? I'm just curious. I know that such a thing happens.
Yeah.
I've seen the perfect storm.
Yes.
But unfortunately, they didn't make it back. They didn't,
Well,
they didn't make it back. Not a good story.
It is a good story. But yeah, no, I did it out of professional curiosity, and
It was very bumpy.
it wasn't too bad. It was like a bad commercial flight.
Really?
Yeah,
Into
yeah.
the eye.
And then when you get in the eye, there's no way to describe it. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
What does it look like out the window?
Crystal clear. You can see the wall of the hurricane, the eye wall around you. So you fly the way we fly and they're P-3 aircraft. So they're Navy aircraft that used to be used for anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War. We got them. We fly them through the hurricanes. They're really well designed.
Wait, so you're saying you're retrofitting things. You don't even
Yeah.
have a special plane for hurricanes.
We don't. We're in the
and should
process
there
of
be?
trying to. Yes, and we have, I think, pretty much convinced Congress to give us the resources to buy tailor-built. I mean, it's the same airframe as used by the military. It's a C-130. So any of you who've got military experience or work for Air Force know the C-130s are kind of the workhorses for the U.S. Air Force. We are working with the manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, saying, hey, outfit this one so we can do the stuff that we do with all the sensors and all the safety equipment. But yeah, we fly them through. We do figure 4 patterns through the hurricane. And the goal is to understand and measure inside the hurricane. The really important parts of the hurricane are the eye walls. And you'll hear people talk about well-organized hurricanes. If I could go down a tangent, this for us is a great source of amusement because all of the hurricanes have names. And so if you look at the Weather Service, they'll say, Thane is well organized today, but tomorrow we expect he'll fall apart.
I see.
So
that's the term.
That's a Weather Service joke.
That's the term.
Right.
Yeah, it's the term.
Yeah, but so well organized means that the eye wall is well formed. And when you fly through the hurricane, when you go through the eye wall, very bumpy, a lot of turbulence, vertical winds. Then you get out in the eye, and that's where there is no wind. It's crystal clear, blue sky above you. You fly for, depending on the size of the hurricane, 5-10 minutes, and bam, you're back on the other side of the eye wall. And it's an amazing experience.
Just curious, and then we'll move from that. What kind of scientist is in that plane? I mean, you were there for other reasons because you run the shop. But,
one of questionable judgment is the first part. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who says I want the hurricane. I want to fly through what is there?
They are amazing people. And in fact, a few of them, they have patches for every 100 hurricane penetrations you go through. And we've got people who've gone through 800,
Are you
1,000.
kidding?
People have been working for NOAA for decades. These are extraordinary scientists. Well, first of all, we have our NOAA Corps officers, and my aide,
Yes, I see her.
Lieutenant Michelle Lovano is an example of one of our 330 NOAA Corps officers. They fly our planes. Some of them come over from Navy. Some of them we train up. They are the ones, they are the crew flying it. Then we have scientists who are manning radars. We've recently started putting drones, launching drones from the airplanes because
Into the hurricane.
Because one thing you don't want to do with an airplane is fly it at low altitude through a hurricane. So we fly ours typically 8 to 10,000 feet. But if you launch a drone, you can actually get the measurements through the whole hurricane.
You're telling me the hurricane does not obliterate a drone?
Well, we don't get them back typically. Yeah. And oftentimes the last bit of data that you get is the sea surface temperature. But we
All
also,
that for that.
we also, I mean, hurricanes, most people think hurricanes are atmospheric phenomena exclusively. They're not. They depend on the ocean. They feed off the ocean. That's where they get their energy. So we've now developed capability for flying through the hurricane, flying over the hurricane, launching drones from the airplane to measure. We use satellites as well. And then we have sensors on the surface of the ocean and in the ocean water itself making measurements. So we can characterize the full environment and we've been able to improve forecasts. And the two main indicators for forecast quality are the track, how accurate is the track, and how accurate is the intensity forecast. And we've been able to improve the accuracy of both of those forecasts by anywhere from 15 to 25% by using the airplanes.
One more fun question. Actually, they're all fun. We are not very far from the Jefferson Memorial. And I came to learn in preparing for this that Thomas Jefferson was to NOAA what one would say Teddy Roosevelt was for the national parks. Everybody remembers Teddy Roosevelt as the first president with a conservationist mindset, and he loved national parks. And thank God he did, right? That was his thing. But I couldn't believe 1807. I know that Jefferson was a tinkerer, he was an inventor of things. Was that why he was interested in atmosphere, water, coasts? What got him into this?
Yeah, I think he was naturally curious. All you got to do is go to Monticello and walk through, and you'll see that he was trying all sorts of things. For his day, he was what we would call a citizen scientist. He did not have so much formal education here, but
by the way, in 1807, was there science?
Yeah, in the sense that wealthy people, you know, think of Isaac Newton and others.
But in atmosphere science.
Yeah, there were people who made observations. Does that qualify as a scientist? I would say it does, because they were trying to be able to, they wanted to predict the weather. They knew that they could do something to understand the weather a little bit more.
And primitive, but it worked in 1807. They were able
forecasting? Not really. Yeah. No, that's why Poor Richard's Almanac was as successful.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking when you said.
But Jefferson worked in a different area. What he said was, if we understand more about what the coast looks like, it will probably help with our commerce. That is to say, if we knew what the Boston Harbor looked like, and Baltimore Harbor and New York Harbor, so why don't we go out and map these? And that was kind of a novel concept.
So mapping.
To map underwater, to make what we call charts, which is basically an underwater map. And for him, I think there were two drivers. One was commerce, to have a better understanding of that. We'll know what size ships can come into these harbors, where are the shoals, do these features change over time? Let's map it today and then go back later. So he started the survey of the coast.
The entire eastern seaboard.
The intent was to survey the whole coast. And that's, in fact, to this day, that is part of our mission, to map all of the U.S. exclusive economic zone. So basically, the coastal waters, including up in Alaska.
So his impulse commercially might explain why you also serve as an Undersecretary of Commerce?
I would hope so. I'd like to think it was his insight.
Yeah, I'm saying that because it's not obvious to me that it should be in the Commerce Department.
That's where I was going to go. So the story, they say, is that NOAA was formed officially by Richard Nixon. And in fact, when he formed NOAA as sort of an aggregation of the Fisheries Bureau, the Weather Bureau, we had these
fisheries
satellites.
Is you too.
Fisheries, marine fisheries. And he said, let's put this somewhere that makes sense. And originally folks said, well, put it in the Department of Interior. It's kind of like Fish and Wildlife or U.S. Geological Survey. The story, I wasn't here, but the story is that Nixon at the time was not fond of Wally Hickel, who was the Secretary of the Interior at the time. So he said, we're going to put it in Congress. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that was prescient. That was spot on, because I actually argue, and I've established as one of my pillars for the agency, that you can actually be a good environmental steward and foster economic development. And for me, it's all about what I call environmental intelligence. That's the business we're in. It's not weather, it's not oceans, it's not fisheries, it's environmental intelligence that can then be used for economic benefit, to foster the development of whole new economic sectors, and basically to support commerce. So that makes sense.
Why do I think that since you're the 11th NOAA administrator, that the other 10 didn't necessarily think of it in environmental terms.
I think 9 of them did. One of them was a lawyer. The other 10 of us were environmental
So
scientists.
everyone saw it that way.
I think so.
Everyone
I do.
understood it that way.
It's a varying degrees, yeah. And I think the economic side of it has only become evident of late. I mean, if you go back 30, 40 years ago, we knew weather impacts the economy. Think of aviation, weather is a strong influence.
But when we think of NOAA, we think of the agency that deals in forecasting weather and dealing with severe storm patterns. Tell us what you think, since you've invested your entire professional life. What is actually, in your view, NOAA's actual mission? Because, one of the things that I think in looking at this, and I was prepped for this from Lori, the vastness of NOAA is shocking. Like the sheer number of people that work for you everywhere around the country. They're all, you just said fisheries. I said fisheries. Like there isn't anything you don't seem to do. And I think it really does seem like an agency that literally, is all over the map of the United States and the world.
And the universe.
And the universe and below the surface. Right.
Yeah.
So it just seems to me, it seems unmanageable. And also what it does, when I think of your job, I think of the awesomeness of nature, right? That you're in my view, like an untamable task, like you're trying to, everything surprises you. You just said 60, what did you say, 6 feet of water?
Yeah, 5 feet of rain.
This is insane, right? And so and the surprising nature of it. You're saying like Mother Nature surprises us sometimes. We forecast something, we didn't see that coming. So what do you think, if you could somehow crystallize and distill, is it purely vast, or in some ways is it, as you just said, just there is an environmental thing?
So there's a couple of ways at unpacking what you just said. And a lot of times the bumper sticker I use is that we are about lives, livelihoods, and lifestyles. And so you can think, well, fisheries, yeah, that's about livelihoods, right? Weather, that's about lives. Marine protected areas, that's a little bit of lifestyles. So that's one way to look at it. The other way is to think of it in this environment.
I'm sorry, say that again. I like that last part. Lifestyles would be, what is it against?
Well, something like creating protected areas, marine protected areas, which in part, I mean, there's a reason you want to do that for.
Can you give us an example of like that?
Sure. We manage the National Marine Sanctuaries system, which is the marine national parks. So, in fact, we're in the process.
So give us, tell right around this area, where are we?
Well, Mallows Bay and Chesapeake Bay is one of the National Marine Sanctuaries. And these are fascinating because most people think, so you're protecting these pristine areas. Yes, Flower Gardens National Marine Sanctuary, spectacular corals. Mallows Bay happens to have incredible historical significance. So historical resources that we want to protect. In the same way that Ellis Island is protected, but at the same time, Yellowstone is protected. One's very much a cultural site. One is very much a natural history
but it has this same purpose.
But it's the same purpose. And in fact, this administration, one of the reasons I came out of retirement to come back to this job is because I really love this administration's focus on protecting and conserving 30% of our lands and waters. So we are right now at NOAA actively trying to establish 6 more national marine sanctuaries.
You came in with the Biden administration.
I did.
He recruited you back in.
The secretary asked me to come in and I said yes.
This administration, at least here, is a success, right? I'm saying we could point to what we're seeing in your.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Like you could point to things and say, this was not happening in the prior 4 years.
At things every level. So at the
I think we just came up with a hook for Biden's campaign. But anyway, go ahead.
So what I love about this job is that it sounds trite, but I wake up every morning knowing that I'm changing the world. I really do. So it could be something as small as just last week, we were in Michigan and we went to a site where we're investing in the restoration of a creek south of Detroit called Ecorse Creek. That restoration project will help 200,000 people prevent flooding in their neighborhood. And more importantly, it's specifically targeting underserved and unserved communities. That's another thing I love about this administration.
Is that when I'm sort of the term of art, which we see nowadays, the word equity? Is
Yeah,
that
that's
an
part of the
example?
equity
Right,
agenda. Yeah,
that would be an inequity result, outcome.
absolutely would be. And in the last 3 or 4 months, I've been to about 12 or 13 similar sites. A lot of them being supported by the bipartisan infrastructure law.
I'm going to get to that, yeah.
But, you know, on a larger basis, I mean, in June, we're going to launch the last of a series of geostationary satellites. What's a geostationary satellite? Turn on the news, or turn on the weather tonight, and the weather broadcaster will undoubtedly show an image of the whole east coast of the United States, showing where the storms are, where the clouds are.
Is that the
That's our satellite.
color-coded thing?
Well, we can color code them. Usually we use basically the photograph that you would get from the satellite just as it comes in.
And it's clear from that what it is.
Absolutely. And any school kid could look at that and say, oh, there's a storm over Massachusetts, or looks like a sunny day in Miami. And that's pretty extraordinary too, managing 16 satellites like that as part of our portfolio.
And 16 now, is that increased over time?
It has increased over
Right,
time.
so like
yeah.
10 years ago, we were not at 16.
Yeah, 10 years, I don't know what the number was, but we've built up to a constellation of 16 satellites over time.
And is there some central command where there's a bunch of people look like NASA and they're looking at the data?
NASA tries to look like us. Yeah, we do. And in fact, there's a satellite operations facility out in Suitland, Maryland, that is an ultra modern. If you went in there, you'd say this looks like every Hollywood version of a command center.
Cool.
And that's where we manage and operate our satellites 24/7. The data that come in are publicly available. Well, a lot of folks say they're free data, right? My answer is no. The American public already pays for them once. You don't have to pay for them twice. So all those data are made available on our websites. But we have 15 ships. Our Navy is larger than New Zealand's Navy. 9 aircraft. And so, you know, your question was about making an impact. And I told you the example of the site in Michigan. Me bragging about how many toys we have really is not particularly impactful. But what it means is that we're using those tools to improve the forecast. Here's another factoid for you. The weather forecast you get today, if you look, you can get a 24, 48, 72, 96, 120-hour forecast, right? Every 10 years, we improve it by 24 hours. Every 10 years, we improve the forecast by 24 hours. That means the 3-day forecast, 72-hour forecast, is as accurate now as the 2-day forecast was in 2014. That's pretty powerful stuff. A lot of people think, great, I can decide whether I'm going to have a picnic or not on Friday. Yeah, that's true. But it also means the aviation industry can start deploying assets, figuring out where planes should or should not be in a way that you're going to have flights canceled for weather less often than you did before.
Talk about commercial.
And yes,
right?
And just-in-time logistics.
There's a very good example of commercial.
Yeah. So your lives are improved. And I don't want to sound too much like an advertisement, but every single American's life is improved by the products we provide for 5.5 cents per American per day.
Oh, wow. That's a great.
It's a good deal.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
I also think the biodiversity of it is always fascinating. It's not true of other agencies. You know, like, you know, your job is so much cooler than the SEC chair. You know, you just, if I was the SEC chair sitting out there, I'd just shoot myself. Right? I would say, I can't believe this guy's job. Like, for instance, you come from Oregon, right? You were a professor out there.
Yeah.
Like, when I think, I'm also from Miami. So when you think of the diversity of this country, right? Like the water, the top, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's people that are out on the West Coast doing very different things and looking at very different things and sharing information with people that are in Key West looking at very different things.
And we can get biblical real fast,
Good.
Noah, in the sense that we talk about floods, drought, fires, extreme heat, sea level rise. I mean, the having a 75-degree clear day doesn't make news. Having tornadoes in Nebraska makes news. And so while it's important for us to be able to predict that 75 degrees clear, it's really important that we can forecast and also long-term project. I mean, that's the other thing. We're mostly talking in this conversation about what can we do for American industry and communities and individuals on a 2, 3, 4, 5 days basis. What we haven't talked about is what do we do on a seasonal basis? What do we do in order to let the building code developers in a county determine what their vulnerability to extreme heat will be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What do we tell the Maui County emergency managers they need to worry about in terms of sea level rise 10 years? So we deal not only in this extraordinarily diverse set of topic questions, but also at timescales from an hour from, well, less than 10 minutes from now is the tornado going to hit, to 100 years from now. What can we expect in terms of sea level rise?
So let's talk about brass tack science. Questions that people always have. What really is, or to you, it's just not even a question, the relationship between climate change, global warming? I learned in getting ready for you, there's also global colding.
Yep.
I learned about the jet stream, which I never really understood how that really works. The stream. By the way, there's so many cool things to read about what this guy does. It's really fascinating. Read about the jet stream. I didn't know what it was. It's really interesting. What is the effect that our living on this planet and not caring for it in the most environmentally gracious way has had actually on the weather? Or as you're saying, weather and climate are really different. We're not really, those are really two things. We deal with both, but they don't overlap with each other.
So my issue is, it's a great question. And if we've got another 3 hours, detail. But first of all, there's an old saying that climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And I like that in the sense that it gives people sort of a perspective. What I don't like about that is weather is what we know. It's basically pressure, temperature, humidity. Rain, what's the wind going to be? It's going to be sunny or cloudy. Climate, that's why I like your question in the context of global warming. Global warming, we don't tend to use that phrase much anymore because that's just one manifestation, right. and it sends the wrong message because it's not a uniform warming. We tend to average it to understand overall, are we looking at 2 degrees centigrade increase? But climate change invokes so many impacts. You think of something like ocean acidification, which we didn't even know about until maybe 20 years ago. That's not a warming effect. It is a consequence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere being absorbed in the ocean. But, the oceans are 30% more acidic than they were even, say, 50, 60 years ago.
Tell me how does that affect us to have that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in one immediate impact, it affects the food supply because it means that some of the microorganisms that depend on that balance of pH in the ocean can no longer survive. And then we all know about the food web and the food chain. And all of a sudden you find that some of the high-level predators like salmon no longer have food to feed on, so there are fewer salmon as a consequence of ocean acidification. So the impacts on the ecosystem are dramatic.
How do you fix that?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of discussion about trying to, we used to call it geoengineering. Now, and in fact, in the UK, they still call it geoengineering or climate intervention. What actions can we take to basically reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, reduce carbon dioxide in the ocean, and therefore minimize everything from warming effects to ocean acidification to sea level rise. And there are fundamentally 2 categories of activity. One is carbon dioxide removal, actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, out of the ocean. The other is...
you're talking about, that's not our preventing it, that's actually removing it surgically?
Yeah, I mean, I should have said mitigation is the first thing. Just stop putting carbon dioxide.
You're saying, but there is another step that can be taken.
And we have to do both. That's the important thing.
And we know how to do that.
Conceptually, from fundamental physics, yes, it's a matter of scaling. How do you scale it? And also, we don't fully understand all of the implications of doing these things to the ecosystem, for example. So
why? Because you said it might have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And, that's a really interesting ethical debate, legal debate, scientific debate. Should we actively reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the ocean, even if we don't know what all the consequences are to the ecosystem?
Because we believe that it has this value or benefit, and we're ready to roll the dice on whatever else might happen.
Or the other way of saying it is, we believe if we don't,
right,
that the downstream consequences are going to be some would say existential.
Forget salmon.
Yeah, you won't have to worry about it because you'll have so many other issues. So it is a raging debate right now, rightfully so. I actually wish it were elevated to the level of some of the other debates that we're having in the political arena right now.
Can I just say, whose job is that to raise that? Is that nonprofits? Is that think tanks?
It's everybody's.
Everyone jumps in
Everybody's.
on that ethical issue?
Yeah, I really think so. I think the public ought to be weighing in. The public needs to understand. One of the positive outcomes, I think, of what's happened, if there is one, a silver lining, if you will, is that now everybody is being impacted, whether you know it or not. Are you paying homeowners insurance? You're impacted. Your health. You know, here in DC, for example, last summer we had these massive smoke clouds coming in from fires in Canada. There are always fires, but just like the discussion on hurricanes, the nature of wildfire has changed. And so we're seeing more of these wildfires. We used to talk about wildfire season, and we talk about year-long wildfires. So that's affecting health. So everybody's impacted.
So you just remind me of something I want to get to. Now's might not be a good time to do it. Last 2023 was the hottest year on record. So does that explain things like not just atmospheric heat, but the oceanic heat?
Some of it.
Does it also have wildfires? Is that related?
Yeah, that's related.
So heat is heat. It's like fires and wildfires. It's all.
That's the code of the night. Heat is heat.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree.
It's not just Miami heat. It's heat everywhere.
Well, but it manifests differently. So the way it so my home in Oregon, when I bought the property 20 years ago, it's on the east side of the Cascade Mountains, called the High Desert. Didn't get that hot. We didn't have wildfires. By the time I sold my home 3 years ago to take this job, we decided we had to clear cut the juniper and sagebrush on our property because the wildfire threat was too large. And we were seeing 100-degree days like 2 weeks in a row. So that's a form.
Wow.
The amount of heat in the oceans, here's another interesting fact. We've added, as a consequence of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the increased solar radiation that's raising the temperature of the oceans and the atmosphere, that's energy, right? Heat is energy. The amount of energy we've added to the oceans over the last 50 years is the equivalent of lighting off 2 Hiroshima atomic bombs every second. Yeah.
Oceanic temperature rising. The effect of that is tantamount to that kind of energy.
Yeah, because it's energy. Heat is energy. So if you look at how much heat has gone into the ocean, and you know how much energy there is in atomic bomb, you can make the equivalence. And it's the fact that
and
it's
is that because of the
second.
vastness of the ocean?
Yeah.
The dispersal.
Yeah, it's a lot of volume of water to be heated up. I mean, you think about heating up a pot of water to make boiled eggs.
Yeah.
It actually takes a lot of heat to get that water boiling. And so, you know, increasing the temperature just a few degrees is really significant. That's what we've seen. And we didn't know that until just a few years ago because we didn't have the capability of measuring the heat in the ocean, which is pretty fundamental too. You think, gee, you know, here we are putting people on the moon. Can't we measure the temperature of the ocean?
What are the consequences of 2 degrees of extra heat in the ocean for the plant life and fish?
2 degrees. I mean, when I talk about the kind of increase in heat in the ocean, we're talking about tenths of a degree so far. So when you start talking about 2 degrees, that's 10 times as much heat going.
You're saying that's boiling.
Effectively,
right?
Yeah, you would see the ecosystems fundamentally change. I mean, we're already seeing that because that heat, it's not like the whole ocean all of a sudden just went up uniformly. It's distributed throughout the ocean. So it's forcing populations of fish, lobsters, all the organisms in the ocean to move. We talk in NOAA about the Alaskan pollock are now Russian. They're moving. When was the last time you were able to get a fresh caught lobster from Connecticut waters? When I was a kid, growing up in New York, you could go up to Connecticut and Rhode Island and get lobster right there. You don't find that fewer and fewer even in Maine. And a lot of that is the consequence of the water's getting warmer and pushing these populations.
Sorry, I'm thinking, but talk about commercial, you know, Billy Joel is obsessed with this in Long Island, right? He's been, you know, an advocate apparently of the coastline and the fishermen, that whole industry being wiped out. And I'm thinking, Yeah, because the fish are going somewhere else.
That's part of it. Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, there are some people who say, yeah, well, that means there's something else coming up from, and there are lionfish in the tropics coming up the East Coast. But that's not the sign of a healthy ecosystem. That's the main.
What does it mean to be a climate ready nation? It's a cool term
Yeah.
of art. What does it mean? Is that your job to get us there? Are we any good at it? How do we compare? Are there better climate ready countries than us?
I think we're doing pretty well. And what it means is that we would know the kinds of things I've been talking about, what's going to happen in terms of seasonal patterns of rain or wildfire. What is sea level going to do in my community? Being climate ready means that we have enough information to make decisions about, should we build a condominium right here? Should we develop an agricultural economy around this crop? Should we have a building code that assumes that there will or won't be hurricanes coming up the East Coast as far as Massachusetts? That's being climate ready. And I'm actually optimistic. Climate ready nation is a concept we developed within NOAA that we are trying to build toward by improving the environmental intelligence, the understanding of what's going to happen in the environment, so that everybody, every community, every industry, every individual can know not just where to go to get the information, but what do you do with this? And that, incidentally, is the difference between the data we collect, the information that you develop from it, and then the intelligence. Intelligence means being able to make a decision based on.
So do other countries use this term of art?
They use forms of it. Yeah, they talk about resilience, obviously. They talk.
But does resilience doesn't sound like it has the intelligence element.
It depends how you interpret it, right? I mean, there's some great work in the EU right now with respect to developing a full portfolio of products that will help the EU adapt to become more resilient to climate change. Is that a climate ready nation? Yeah, I'd say it is.
What is your number, you know, that like MI6, you know, what is the version of NOAA in other countries in the West?
Oh, yeah.
Do they have NOAAs?
Well, actually, a lot of nations actually have ministries of the environment. In fact, I just signed an agreement in Singapore last week with their Ministry of Sustainability and Environment.
What was that agreement on?
It was a general MOU, Memorandum of
Let's
Understanding.
work together.
Work together, mostly around a couple of things. They're very concerned about heat, of a climate change impact. They want to be able to get a longer lead time on when are they going to have extremely hot days in Singapore. We're working on the same thing. We want to be able to do that. So can we share scientific understanding, but also observations? So we have agreements. We are a national, that is to say a domestic agency. Our job is to support the United States communities, individuals, industry. You can't do that. You can't do an environmental job without having observations around the world. We can't predict the weather here in the US without knowing what's happening in the Western Pacific.
So wait a minute, let me get this straight. The 16 satellites don't buzz around Africa.
Well, some of them do because they actually orbit the poles. Some of them stay in one position.
But I'm just curious, there's no international breach of protocol. It's not like you're spying on other countries. It's not like the scientists that are looking at the atmosphere, the satellites can do what they're doing.
Well, and it's not like we all sing kumbaya around the table. There are actually formal agreements through organizations under the United Nations. The World Meteorological Organization is where we go. And
so you can make a phone call and get information, data shared.
Oh yeah, we do that all the time. And WMO, it makes it easier for us because we don't have to have 100 different bilateral agreements on things like data availability. So through the WMO and another organization, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic.
So everyone's in on that?
Mostly. I mean, different nations have different policies about data.
Rogue states that really could give a shit about stuff like this?
I mean, there's countries that really, first of all, a lot of them don't have the capacity or capability for making these kinds of observations.
You're saying it's not even their fault.
Or
this is a luxury.
On them. Yeah,
this is a luxury that not every nation can.
That's right.
Can undertake.
That's right. Yeah, and so that I take that as a major responsibility on our part. And in fact, we actually engage in capacity building. We have a facility right here in College Park, where we train meteorologists from all over the world.
They come in.
They come in, they'll spend 6 months learning how to make observations, use the models that we help develop. We share our models with them. That is to say, the computer programs that allow them to put data in and get forecasts out.
You know, my favorite thing, that movie Martian, I love so much about that, is that in the end, the Chinese give up their rocket in order to get Matt Damon home. And there always gives you that, remember you've seen the movie, you gotta see it. That's a cool part. They send the Chinese version, and they all sing a song at the end. What's great about what you do is that it seems somewhat detached from the kind of national acrimonies.
Oh, I would actually go further, and I would say that we can help with soft diplomacy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The diplomacy is exactly the right word.
Yeah.
I think about this all the time. It's like, scientists, when they get together,
They don't care.
they don't care about it. They don't even think about that.
In most of our agency, we have 12,000 people. I'll get the actual numbers wrong, but the vast majority of our folks are scientists and engineers working in environmental or data scientists. And for them, knowing an expert who's working in France or Japan just means it's a harder phone call to make. But they're working together all the time. We have to collect data to build new capabilities.
The Inflation Reduction Act, which always just sounded like a misnomer, because it does all sorts of other things, right? It's about inflation. Well, yeah, and that's other things. One of the things I learned about that has a lot to do with you.
It does, yeah.
Infrastructure now is part of the Inflation Act. And infrastructure, the way we understood it years ago, was bridges and bandwidth. Remember when bandwidth was the big infrastructure? But it seems like now NOAA is a recipient of some of this, that your agency is being perceived as, or has it always been understood as, an infrastructure of the United States?
I think whether people knew it or not, they understood that we were working in the infrastructure world. So if you think about what we do, coastal resilience, I would argue, invokes an element of infrastructure, right? Making sure that the coastline of New Jersey is more resilient against coastal storms than it was before.
And all those people with houses in Malibu.
Yeah.
Because they're rich and they're really, they're scared.
There is an equity angle on this, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so a lot of what we're trying to do with the coastal resilience funds is tied to making sure that the communities who otherwise might not have had the benefit of these investments do get the benefit.
So it's a different way of looking at it.
It is
It's
very
not
different.
just to make sure that your mansion on Malibu Coast doesn't fall into the Pacific.
No, and in fact, we actually quantify that. We have, there's a big push in this administration to ensure environmental justice. Well, what is that? It means doing things like looking at socioeconomic factors on census tract. So the Census Bureau of Census collects that kind of socioeconomic demographic information. Where are the most vulnerable communities? I can tell you, as an environmental scientist, I can tell you this area in Florida is more vulnerable to hurricane landfall than another area. Layer on top of that, those areas that are both more physically vulnerable and more vulnerable from a socioeconomic perspective. But it's not just race and socioeconomics. I'll give you another example. One of the things we're doing with equity is we realized we put out our weather forecasts to coastal communities, fishing communities. And in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a very, very large Vietnamese immigrant fishing community.
Aren't they also in Texas?
And in Texas, yes.
Yeah.
In the Gulf Coast, they're scattered
right.
around. But we weren't providing them weather forecasts in Vietnamese. So that's an equity issue.
Yeah.
So now
I
we're
would think.
actually using AI to do language translation on our weather forecasts. So we can put it out and then have AI translate.
That's huge.
It is huge.
Yeah.
And it's going to mean we're serving a vastly larger and more diverse community than we ever did before.
Didn't we learn the hard way in Louisiana? Right.
On
The hurricanes.
we learned a lot.
I'm saying,
Yeah.
right. I'm in terms of equity.
Yeah,
Because
we
it just
have.
destroyed.
Yeah, and that's one area in Louisiana, also Mississippi, Alabama, where we've said, let's take advantage of our sister bureau, the Census Bureau, who collects information like this, and see if there's ways we can do in our product. What we call products is like forecasts and data packages.
So infrastructure doesn't mean we're going to get that pooled hurricane jet. That's not how you're going to use that money.
No, but we will use it for things like high performance computing. That's infrastructure too.
So that is one way that.
That is.
Deployment of the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's part of it.
Tell me about the 5th National Climate Assessment. Frankly, I missed the first 4.
Well, you should read the 5th.
Yeah, I mean,
Read the summary.
Can I could just start at the 5th and I
Yeah.
know what happened before? I don't have to go back and cheat.
This isn't like a novel or like a, a
Like
detective
Harry
series.
Potter, you just
Yeah,
can't
no, you
start
don't-
at the
yeah,
end.
Yeah. The National Climate Assessment, actually, this one, so we are by law required to do these on a regular
So
basis.
this is a national obligation. We
Yes.
do this. This is not a global thing.
Well, other nations do similar kinds of things, but we by law, in the Global Change Act, are required to do that. And so we do it every several years, and it is what the title suggests.
We is you.
It's all
NOAA.
government. It's not just government, it's academic partners, industry partners. Teams are built, teams that will focus on particular threats like flood, teams that will focus on how good is the science, how good are the models. There are teams that are around, if you will, the science piece. There are teams that are built around the impacts piece, cause and effect.
What about other government agencies? Do they?
Oh, yeah,
They're in it.
absolutely. All agencies that have any equity in climate are part of it.
All coordinated by NOAA?
Coordinated by the White House.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
but
who does that sort of thing in the White House?
the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So as the name suggests, they are in charge of science and technology policy.
And that's a person that whoever that
It's a
group,
president science advisor. Yeah.
who
Arati
you obviously
Prabhakar.
know very well.
I know her, yeah.
Yeah, must
Yeah.
know her very well.
Yeah,
And so
reasonably well.
their job is to actually assemble this whole package.
Yeah, and so they rely on the agencies because it's a small office. So they'll turn to an agency like NOAA and say, okay, we need volunteers. We need people to lead these chapters. We need people to lead the discussion. So we'll do that. NS, National Science Foundation will do that. Department of Energy, Department of Interior, all of the agencies will do that. And we have thousands of scientists in collaboration with our academic partners, with industry experts to try to develop an understanding and assessment of how climate change has impacted the country.
And what in the end happens? This thing goes online and we can read it, or is it just for pros?
No, you can go online, read it. And in fact, one of the most important parts of the NCA, the National Climate Assessment, is the summary for policymakers. So if you read nothing else, read the summary for policymakers because that's written in plain English. And it basically says, okay, this is what we've seen in terms of changes in temperature. This is what we've seen. This is what we can expect in terms of sea level rise on the coast of Georgia over the next couple of decades.
Is the atmospheric science federal or state? Do states have their own entities?
Some of them do. California has a pretty robust portfolio.
And it's a separate thing?
separate from the feds, yeah.
They work with you?
Oh, yeah, yeah. All the
Again,
time.
same idea. Science, they speak the same they're diplomats with each
Yeah,
other.
a lot of times we'll have people moving from state offices to federal offices. At NOAA, we pride ourselves on the fact that we have a workforce of 12,000. 2/3 of our workforce is not in DC. They are out in the field working with state agencies, sometimes co-located with state.
Never conflicts.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, there are conflicts.
Is there a federalism thing that when it comes to weather, when it comes to
Not
atmosphere,
weather, no.
it's us over you?
Well, by law, the National Weather Service is the authoritative source of weather information. And quite honestly, we're so good at it that the states don't feel like they have to create their own capability.
And California has their own because they're especially worried about like earthquakes and they don't think.
So California has components of their structure to look at air quality, water quality, and that's because they have their own set of laws, as you all know better than I. And they want to make sure that they're able to get the science that supports their policy development appropriately. So they rely on us, but they complement what we do with their very special expertise.
All right, so here's where I acknowledge that the audience is way smarter than me. These are really good questions. Like I gave you the doofus questions. All right, now we got audits. Like
Now you got me worried.
Now, okay, you ready?
Yeah, I'm
You
ready.
want to take a break?
Nope, I'm good to go. I'm sipping water.
I swear I'm scared of these questions. I hope everyone. All right, so this one, I love
In
this
English?
one. Yeah.
Okay.
Not my English, but can you comment on the solar flare, solar activity projections? I believe, I love this part. I believe there's a recent NASA report. This person, this
Yeah.
person is, dribbling between their legs.
Yeah.
This is a very
No,
inside
that's a great
baseball.
question.
This is a great question.
So first thing I'll
What does
say
it
is that,
mean?
let me explain. What it means is that the sun has storms. And basically, if you were able to see the eclipse, you know, the great pictures of the eclipse, it wasn't this crisp symmetric ring. There was all sorts of stuff going on.
Yeah.
And there are what are called coronal mass ejections, which, as the name suggests, that's basically what a solar flare is. These ejections of plasma, of charged gases, that when they travel towards the Earth can interact with our magnetic magnetosphere, basically the magnetic fields around the Earth. And importantly, they can cause really dramatic impacts on electrical grids, on communication systems, GPS.
That's happened?
Yes.
In
it has
history.
happened.
That's-
In fact, there was an event in Quebec a few years back that there was a big blackout in all of Quebec. It was attributable to a geomagnetic storm, solar flare. We have the responsibility at NOAA for the solar weather, the sun weather, if you will, space weather, I should say, prediction. We have the responsibility to say, oop, there was a flare on the sun. On Tuesday morning, you can expect a higher probability of impacts on electric grids. Power companies then can make accommodations because it doesn't hit the whole Earth. It'll hit certain grids.
It's another vision of forecasting.
It is exactly,
right.
which is why we call it space weather. Now, NASA has a massive heliophysics, that is to say physics of the sun, research program. So NASA has developed these extraordinary capabilities for making these observations, looking at the sun. The sun is on a cycle. So every, I want to say 17 years, I believe, there's increased solar activity. And 2025 is predicted to be a period of higher solar storm activity.
And NASA is on it.
They're on it. We're on it. We work like this. They have the research responsibility. They make the observations. We have the forecast.
Press is not interested in this? Because I would have been interested in reading that. Will they cover something like that?
They do. There's some out there that are perhaps geekier than others that cover this. And like so many of these things, you know, the coverage happens when, yeah, if we had a
Something
power
bad
outage
happens.
here, or GPS was down, or you couldn't use the internet, press would be all over it. But our goal is to make sure that it's not happening.
There we go. How is NOAA addressing, quotes, return periods? Once in 200-year storms are now being seen in 50 to 100 years instead.
Yeah.
Does NOAA adjust the return periods?
So
let's go back to return periods. I love that. I
Yeah.
don't know what it means. But
well, and I wouldn't say make a correction. I want to
can I tell you something? Lori's very impressed with that. I can see it in her face. She's going, wow, let's hire that person.
And saying, I wonder what he's going to say now.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So the first thing is, and we learned this from our engineering colleagues, is that when you tell people it's a 200-year storm or 500-year storm, folks generally don't understand. Why did I have two 500-year storms? So what we've started doing, and it's really the engineers that are doing this, is we don't call them 100-year storms. We call them 1% storms. 500-year storm would be a 0.2% storm. That is to say, in any given year, there is 0.2% probability of the storm. And so, I mean, this is a really good question because I boil it down to how good are you at predicting the 1%, 0.2% events? And I'll be the first to say that's some of the toughest things to predict. What, especially if you're talking about relatively long lead times. What we can do is take sort of a statistical approach to it. By that, I mean that, for example, we have not put out our hurricane outlook. We'll do that on May 16th, 23rd. Thank you, Lori.
She's good.
She is really
She's
good.
good.
I am only as good as the great staff I've got. I will be the first to say that. You've all probably seen that some other groups, there's a group in Colorado State, AccuWeather, some others, have already put out their projections to say it's going to be a very active hurricane season. I would be surprised if ours doesn't come in similar to that. But that's sort of a statistical approach. Some of those will undoubtedly be high category, category 3, 4, or 5. Those happen at very low frequency. So we're telling you there is, if we say it this way, there is a better than even chance that you will see a 1% storm. this year, something like that. So it's dealt with statistical. That means the public needs to understand statistical probabilistic forecasting, which for us is a real problem. To go down another dark alley, the American Meteorological Society did a study a few years ago on how people interpret 50% chance of rain in Washington, D.C. And the number of people who thought that meant, oh, it will only rain on the north side of the Potomac, but not the south side, or it'll only rain from 12 to 6 in the evening, not from 6 to 12. So we got a lot of work to do to get people to understand probabilistic
Yeah,
forecasting.
I was one of those people. Who thought that makes sense to me. It's this side of the Potomac. All right, here we go. Here we go. Really smarty pants. Is unilateral geoengineering ethical? Or does that sort of action ethically need to be decided at the global UN United Nations level? So first of all, what is unilateral geoengineering mean, and is it ethical?
So that's what I was alluding to earlier. Let's take the unilateral out for a minute.
What
The
we're talking about,
geoengineering is
right.
the climate engineering, the, if you will, manipulation.
So it's really variations of that.
Well, the question is by unilateral, I think the questioner was asking across the globe, a commitment to do this thing. Well, you know, it might be spraying sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere to reduce how much sunlight.
Wait, is that because you're saying the United States could do this on its own or would not do it on its own?
How many of you have read Ministry for the Future? No hands are going up. Your required reading is Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, a science fiction book that came out, I want to say about 10 years ago. And I'll only tell you the start. The start of it is that India, the nation of India, decides too many of its population are dying. Temperature has gotten up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So they unilaterally decide to launch 10,000 airplanes and spew aerosols into the upper atmosphere, which is a way of reducing the sunlight coming in to cool down India. Violates all of these international laws and treaties. And I'll let you read the rest of the book. The idea here is, you know, we're getting to a point of extremes where somebody could unilaterally choose to geoengineer. And the question was about the ethics.
Right.
This requires a global conversation.
Does the United Nations actually have a forum for such a thing?
Well, they have several forums. Certainly the World Meteorological Organization would be the place to go to talk about the technical capabilities.
Where are they?
They're in Geneva. But the question, the reason I liked the question was it was about the ethics on this. And this, I am no more qualified than others in the room, and I'm sure there are some who are more qualified than I to talk about the ethical issues here. I will give you my personal perspective, and that is that there are risks, there are great risks associated with doing these things. But it's not like we haven't been doing a grand experiment unintentionally for the last 100 years with all of the burning of fossil fuels. So we're already impacting the ecosystems and the atmosphere and the ocean.
But does intent matter?
I think it does.
Because in that case, it was bad intent. And in this case, it's good intent.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think anybody 100 years ago said, you know, let's start building these internal combustion machines because that's how we're going to make the world warmer. I don't think they said that.
But did they not? Look, we know from just the 19th century England, right? We know what, at some point, when I was in graduate school, I don't know how many of you New Yorkers, when I was in graduate school, the Dakota, which is what became famous because that's where John Lennon and Yoko lived, was, and you would know this because you were there, the building was black and it was soot. And so when we think of like industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Manchester, they must have understood that the post-industrial consequences of energy being used in this way is making people cough and is making buildings turn color. At some point they understood and they knew that they had these other goals, but they knew they were doing damage. I'm thinking when we're talking about geoengineering, the intent is a good intent. It's in saying, That's remember I asked you a question, how do we fix it? Right? The impulse is fixing. So I'm just wondering, does intent matter? Say, look, what we're throwing caution to the wind, so to speak, because wind is another atmosphere, but we're at least doing it for cautionary reasons. We're not doing it to pump more oil, to make more money. We're doing it to save the planet.
At what
Even though
expense?
there are risks.
Yeah, and that's the question is at what expense and what are we willing to tolerate in terms of the impact? I think that the wrong argument is we can do these things and there will be no other consequences. That we know is not true. So just characterizing what the consequences are. And your question in retrospect would be, did the 19th century society decide to do all of these things? Because after all, they lived longer, right?
Right.
They were living more comfortably. The food was probably safer to eat.
You're saying they thought they were advanced.
I think they did. And I think they did. And have we gotten smarter? I think we have gotten smarter in the sense that we understand the connections of the systems. And people didn't, I mean, talk about connections. When I was a graduate student, granted, it was years ago, but I remember one of my professors saying, he was a wine aficionado, and he said there's a connection between El Nino and the good Bordeaux years in France. We thought he was crazy. How can that possibly? So we have learned a lot about the connections, the connectivity of the Earth system. Now, every school kid knows, yeah, what happens in the Pacific with El Nino is going to affect the weather in Europe. People know this.
We're growing better olives now than we did because of this, or worse olives, something. One last question. You already sort of touched on it. It's something that with folks we're always interested in, cultural representations of things. You mentioned what sounded like a science fiction book, which is now not a science fiction book, right? I think you even said that earlier.
Yeah, my argument is we should move it from science
just move
fiction
it,
to the
because right
public
now
policy
that
section of the library.
book
Yeah.
about India is exactly where we are now. And it was embodied in that question about the ethics. But what, of disaster films, has in art, in culture, in books, fiction and nonfiction, is there anything that gets it right in an interesting way that a person can learn something that that is fundamentally correct? Because, and the reason I'm asking this question is because, and I've been interested in this as a law professor, because unfortunately or unfortunately, people learn a lot of their information from culture.
Yeah.
Right? People, unfortunately, they'll learn their history from movies. They think they know who Johnny Cash is because they saw Walk the Line. I don't, all those biopics, we had Oliver Stone once as a guest. Got him twice and once. And I asked him about the movie JFK. And I'm not as easy, it's conversational, but if there's a moment I'm going to get to something, I'm going to get to something. You had a vulnerability, I would have gone. And I said I'm merciless. So in a conversational way, I said, Oliver, there's hundreds of people that studied the Kennedy assassination. And they looked at your movie, which everyone saw, and they said, you picked the most crackpot theory of how Kennedy was killed. And you took Kevin Costner and a lot of other great actors. You made a really cool movie, and you just drew all sorts of stuff. The mob, Castro. I mean, I've just seen JFK. It's a mess, right? And I guess it makes for a better movie, but that's what people know about the Kennedy assassination. So there are consequences to all these films about volcanoes and hurricanes and tornadoes, right? I mean,
yeah. So I know where you're going.
Right? Didn't Spielberg do a film on Twister or something?
Well, yeah, there was a film Twister, and we were actually technical advisors on that film. Oh, by the way,
when you were here or when you were at Oregon?
No, it was when I was at NOAA in a previous job.
Oh.
And that first Twisters movie, you may remember the bad guys were industry. The original version of it, the bad guys were the government lab. And
you fixed that.
Yeah, one of our guys fixed that. Yeah, so I'm eager to see the next one. So I think the difference, if I compare the Oliver Stone story, I think it's safe to say that most people know that JFK was assassinated. And they know that there's a variety of theories. So he actually gets to start from a place that's different from where we start.
A
so
historical event that we all understand happened.
President assassinated, happened in Dallas, 1960. Yeah, got it. The problem we have in the environmental side is that We don't have that same level of knowledge about issues. So my answer might surprise you. One of the cultural pieces was this particular book I talked about day after, or sorry, the Ministry for the Future. But where I was going is Day After Tomorrow. Okay, a goofball kind of.
I'm so glad
movie.
you brought that up.
Well, but one of the things I like is a lot of
Environmental.
environmental
We've all
science.
seen this movie, right? Day After Tomorrow.
It's horrible from a scientific standpoint, except it raises.
Or if you
questions.
live in New York in an expensive condo, it's terrible.
That's true. But it got people asking about how could global warming translate to a ice forming in New York or
Basically,
actually-
the whole northeast of America
which
turns into
actually is
ice.
a really interesting, not quite that dramatically, not happening
You're
in
serious?
24
You're saying
hours.
that actually scientists looked at that movie and said, "Wow, there's something interesting about that."
There's something interesting. Yes. Is it accurate? No. But the interesting thing is it got people asking, how could they possibly translate global warming into icing up in the Northern Hemisphere?
Right.
And there is a consequence of climate change, which results in freezing, in basically the slowing down of the circulation of the North Atlantic and freezing up of a lot of Northern Europe. So where I'm going with this is that a lot of these movies, with the possible exception of things like Sharknado, I would say, but a lot of these movies do have a scintilla of scientific credibility. And I think it's incumbent on us as environmental scientists to say, forget all this other goofy stuff. But why do you think they would have New York freezing up in a movie about global warming? So from my standpoint, that's the value of some of these really off the wall kind of.
I think it
scientific
serves the
treatments.
purpose of
And the interesting
environmentalists.
thing is many universities have now said, let's have film reviews of some of these movies.
Yeah.
And what's come out is that students who might otherwise not want to learn about environmental sciences,
Yeah.
they get something out of it.
And it's-
Even if what they get out of it is, no, the North Atlantic cannot freeze overnight. You know, okay, that's a low bar, but it's a start in getting young people to understand that there are complicated consequences of climate change. To me, that's a win.
To show you how scary this movie is, I think that 3/4 of the Statue of Liberty is caked in ice.
Right.
That is scary. What?
Yeah.
Right?
But you
People
gotta
are on the
admit, Thane,
top of skyscrapers
so-
trying to survive.
In the right hands, there's about 1,000 questions. How does seawater freeze? Does seawater freeze? It's a great question. You can do a whole lecture on thermodynamics of seawater compared to freshwater. So I see these as providing some stimulus to have a meaningful scientific discussion. But it means that you have to have somebody knowledgeable about science there to say, this part's nonsense, this part makes sense, this part begs the question of whatever it may be.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Spinrad.
Thank you.
That was fun. Thank you. If you're interested in more FOLCS programming, there is a Georgetown element to this. Rod Rosenstein, got it right, Rod Rosenstein participated last year. We have an event at the 92nd Street Y that is broadcast virtually. It's called the Law of the Land this year. Olivia, what date is it? See, I have like a Lori.
Yeah.
Somebody who tells me what to do. July 8th, right? July 8th, we have something called Law of the Land, and we don't have Rod, but we have your dean, Bill Traynor, will be in New York with another cast of, and what's really great about Law of the Land, it's called the Supreme Court's Year in Review. And we look at it for civilians, not law professors. So I bring in someone from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and it's done in this sort of chatty way. And you walk away an hour later. We always say you never leave a FOLCS event stupider. You always walk away smarter. And so if you're interested, July 8th, go to folks.org and you can see Bill Traynor in action. It's really great. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.